James knelt in chains in front of the cold metal floor, glaring up at the three towering alien commanders. They called him pathetic, sneering at his fragile form. Taken from a small, quiet colony, he was the only human they had ever encountered. But their derisive laughter ignited a fire in him. He would not stay caged. He would use their arrogance as a weapon against them. A legend was about to come to life. They referred to themselves as the Varn. Their smooth gray skin, excessive growth and glassy, serrated eyes made them terrifying to behold. But James had been raised on tales of alien perils. He never expected to encounter them, let alone find himself their captive. But that is precisely what happened when the Varn assaulted his small outpost on the fringes of human space. James was a farmer's son. He knew how to repair machines, cultivate land, and contend with the whims of the weather. He was also a thinker. His parents instilled him to keep calm in the trouble. He felt terror clawing his heart when the Varn ships descended from the sky and burned the fields. Even so, he assisted the younger kids to shelter in the storm simply. Their joints rattled with the force from alien armaments. Then came the moment he would never shake. He looked up and spied a looming shape overhead, capturing him in a bright beam. They brought him aboard their flagship, the Radiant Spear. It was a giant ship clad in black plates of metal. Inside, every space was occupied by bright corridors and machines buzzing. Tall and proud and alien, the commanders appraised him as if he were a strange beast. They exercised his strength, poked him with probes, and sent theorizing his responses. They found a broken wing, but not the soul within. And so they laughed, thinking he would never fight back. Ironically, James was on a mission to defy them. He watched the routine, shift changes, guard patrols, technical tasks. The Varn were powerful, but their pride rendered them careless. They believed humans were too weak to make a difference. James observed that the Radiant Spear had a complicated control center, manned by several officers who did not always get along with each other. One commander resented the ambition of another. Some of the lower-ranked crew felt flustered by their superiors' demands. James saw an opportunity to exploit these ruptures. All the while the galaxy was watching. Humanity had only just broken its bonds to Earth. Theories that humans could survive in hostile territory were still met in many worlds with disbelief. If James faltered, he could validate every suspicion. If he succeeded, he could transform how other species perceived humanity. The stakes were high, and in every moment he could hear the alien commanders laugh at his pathetic shape and feel the full weight of it. The Radiant Spear slipped through warp corridors, en route to the Varn homeworld. James also found that the ship's power structure was rigid, but brittle. Some crew members were even hiding secrets and grudges against Commander Zakesh, the most senior alien on the ship. Zakesh required absolute submission. Punishment was meted out to anyone who questioned orders. This mood created frustration and fear, and James meant to exploit that. He subdued himself, pretending to be meek, convincing them that he was broken. In fact, he eavesdropped on the reverbs of the hallways, heard whispered arguments, even learned a couple of commands on the control panels after guards neglected to shoo him away. He bided his time. Then came the moment he knew he wasn't alone. As James was being dragged through a side corridor, he caught a glimpse of an alien engineer who observed him with pity, not contempt. That engineer's name was Thyra, and she had at one point challenged Zakesh's brutal methods. For that, she had been stuck with menial work. James felt a potential ally. The first task was to figure out a way to speak to her alone. And it was not until James gradually gave hints to his intelligence that the other aliens stopped ignoring James. He had fixed a slight circuit in his cell, which earned him quizzical glances from the guards. He also applied his mechanical skills to rigging a minor power surge in one of the ship's minor systems. This added to the confusion on board the crew, particularly given that the cause was clearly maintenance and not sabotage. James managed to tell Thura about the chaos that had erupted, but just for a moment. He wanted to know if she had ever dreamed of another life. Her eyes flashed with a sudden interest. Tension kept building on the Radiant Spear. Commander Zakesh expected results from his officers. They had to bring the human to the High Council for a display of strength. But Zakesh also had to demonstrate that the Varn were better, so he was determined to humiliate James. He organized a public demonstration in which James was made to kneel in front of the crew. What James didn't know was he was about to do much more than that. James collected tiny tools every day, quietly, a loose wire, a scrap of broken metal plate, even a wrecked communicator. Piece by piece, he was constructing a way to evade particular security protocols. He observed how each day the ship's energy field was recharged and how a particular console could override door locks. If it wasn't secure, he could unlock every door on the detention level. That's when the real trouble would start. He also noticed how the Varn looked at one another. Some had hard faces, whose loyalty was only to Zakesh. Others appeared weary of carrying out orders they opposed. He saw, too, that even a great ship like the Radiant Spear could be laid low by infighting. If he could instigate a rebellion, the whole command structure could collapse. It all depended on whether he could survive long enough to set his plan into motion. The alien commanders were smug, that was for certain, but they were not utterly blind. They stationed guards outside his cell door, and they tracked his movements. Still, James had hope. He was one person, one human, but he had the heart to fight. If he won, he would not just save himself, he would also demonstrate to the galaxy that humans were definitely not weak. An unseen force was about to rise, and it would rattle the whole cosmos. James knew that his time was limited. The Radiant Spear streaked through the star lanes towards the Varn homeworld. In time, he would come to be celebrated like a living trophy. He figured he'd better move before that occurred. He robbed a convenience store while the commanders watched and bided his time. Finally, he discovered it during a shift change. Two guards were bickering over a communication error from the bridge. As they prepared to respond, James quickly inserted a small device into the control panel outside his room. It was a circuit breaker he had made from junked parts. A brief push activated a close-range glitch. That stuffed the lock system with a surge of data. The cell door hissed open. James, in a heartbeat, shot out of the hallway, plastering himself against the wall. One guard saw the door moving. He lunged for James, but James ducked, using the guard's momentum to send him careening into the other. As the guards grappled, James rushed into the hallway. He had memorized the route to the engineering bay, where Thura worked. If he could get to her, they might stand a chance of making it out, or more. Heartbeat pound behind him. Alarms blared. The hunt was on. He turned a corner to be met by a squad of Varn waiting. On impulse, James ducked into a maintenance shaft. As he crawled through the narrow tunnel, he depended on his sense of the ship's layout. The alarms blared from all around, but he settled his breathing. His main weapon was not strength, but cleverness. Thura was already there when he dropped into the engineering bay from an overhead vent. She looked at him with astonishment and worry. James held up a hand before she could speak. He said in a soft voice, "I know you don't. Support Commander Zakesh. I've seen it in your eyes. I need your help." Thura hesitated, flicking her eyes at the cameras. Then she hurriedly took him behind a mammoth engine coil, where the bearded man was obstructed from the onlooking security feed by heavy metal obstructions. "I don't want any more brutality," she said, her voice shaking. "But if we assist you, Zakesh will punish us all." James nodded. "I'm not asking you to die for me. I just need an opportunity to get to the bridge. If the crew sees their leaders being challenged, they may perform a coup. There's a lot of anger here. We can use that." Thura pondered, her big black eyes flashing. She then passed him a data key. "This will get you through some of the encrypted doors, but not all. You'll need more. I also know a team of engineers who despise Zakesh. If I tell them we can take down the commander, they'd fight with us." Hope surged in James's chest. "Then do it. We'll bring together anyone who is thirsty for liberty." They had little time. The alarms intensified. Through the loudspeaker, a garbled voice ordered all personnel to come to engineering. Commander Zakesh ordered James, captured right away. Thura moved James into the crawl space behind the console. Once inside, he dug into his pocket and produced a tiny communicator. It had been lifted from the guard's belt. He was able to connect it to the ship's internal systems. Now, he could listen in on Varn security chatter in real time. At the same time, Thura started to beat the bushes, reaching out to those trusted peers. She whispered to them in hushed tones that the human was not simply a frightened captor. He was smart, and he had a strategy. She emphasized how they were following Zakesh into an infinite war, how dissent could have no place in his rule. Some aliens scoffed at the idea of heeding a human, but others, weary of tyranny, took heed. James used that time to cause havoc in more systems. There, he overloaded a power conduit close to the detention block, freeing a handful of other prisoners caught from various worlds. They were bruised and frightened, but they, too, thirsted for revenge. It started a bit of a riot in the lower decks. Security teams scrambled to try to contain it. And that chaos was precisely what James required. He crawled out of his hiding place, stepping cautiously over tangled wires. Seeing a team of armed guards around a lift, he hid behind a crate. His heart pounded. If he could make it to that lift, he would have direct access to the bridge corridor. But the guards blocked the way, weapons ready. At that moment, a contingent of thorough loyal engineers took over the far end of the bay, shouting. They shouted, claiming they were overworked and under poor working conditions, attracting the guards' attention. And the second the guards looked the other way, James raced for the lift. He scrambled to the controls and punched in the data code he had got from Thoraz's key. The doors slid open and he jumped inside, smashing a button for the bridge. On the way up in the lift, James was aware of every second becoming an eternity. He was unarmed. If he engaged Commander Zakesh in person, it would be a matter of surprise, and that more rebels were on the way. The Varn might have been bigger and stronger, but they were not united. That was his advantage. As the lift doors opened, James stood in a large, circular hallway where they funneled into the command center. With red emergency lights flashing overhead, and a disembodied voice repeating warning provisions in the Varn tongue, James took a step forward, his heart beating fast. In front of him were footsteps and shouting. He flattened himself against the wall as a pair of security officers ran past, heading toward the lower decks. They didn't see him in the flickering light. He crept toward the command center door. It was locked, sealed by a code so high level. He removed Thoraz's data key and slid it into the port. The console buzzed in disavowal. The clearance was not enough. Despair almost crushed him. Then he spied a side console marked with Varn symbols. Perhaps it was an override. If he entered the proper commands, maybe, just maybe, he could override the security. The catch was that the text was in alien language. He could only guess. He called Thoraz on the communicator, saying quietly, "I'm at the door, but I can't get in. I need help." Her voice crackled back, "I will lead you. Tell me what symbols you see." James read them out loud, explaining each shape. Thoraz quickly informed him which sequence to press. He did as she instructed with trembling fingers. The door hissed and slid open. He was in. Holographic displays floated around a central console in the command center. Dressed in ornate uniforms, officers out of breath rushed to their posts, where they scrambled to contain the panic that was spreading around the ship. In the middle was Commander Zakesh, barking commands. Under red lights, the imposing figure cast a long shadow. Zakesh whipped around at the sound of the door opening, eyes widening in fury when they landed on the human. "How did you?" he started. But James had already gone. He sprinted for the console and ducked under an officer's attempt to grab him. If he could just bring his whole body to bear on the right controls, he might be able to power down the ship's internal defenses, open the hangar to vacuum, anything to tip the scales. Just before James could make it, an iron hand clutched his shoulder. Zakesh threw him down on the floor. Pain shot up and down my body, James told the doctors and surgeons in the operating room. He would not yield, gritting his teeth. "You dare defy the Varn?" Zakesh roared. James coughed and tasted blood but forced a grin. "You were never supposed to laugh at me," he said. The commander drew a fist, ready to pound. Then the ship shuddered with an explosion. Sparks flew from the ceiling. The insubordinate engineers had destroyed the power cores. The whole command center shook. Seizing on the distraction, James rolled out of the way of Zakesh's blow. He leapt to his feet and smacked his palm against the biggest lever on the console. He didn't know what it did, but it triggered a chain reaction of alarms. The overhead lights dimmed, replaced by a strobing emergency glow. The war itself had spun out of all control. From within, The Radiant Spear was under siege. Loyalist guards clashed with armed rebels. Fires burned in the hallways. And at the center of all of it was James, bruised but unbowed, confronting a furious commander. The lines were drawn. Now there would be no turning back. Most of the bridge rattled from the force of secondary detonations. Panels sputtered and smoke curled from busted screens. Zakesh turned his hate-filled gaze onto James. "You're going to pay for this," the commander barked, stepping forward. But just at that moment, a group of rebel engineers stormed in through a side entrance, weapons aloft. Thera was at the front, eyes afire with determination. "Stand down, Commander," she yelled, voice shaky but resolute. "We are finished living under your iron-fisted rule." The officers of Zakesh stared at one another in confusion. Some were loyal, but others had become tired of his strict methods. A few lowered their weapons. That tension now snapped. James, off balance, saw the proud Varn commander finally understand that he was losing control. "You traitors," Zakesh said, hissing. He brought up an energy pistol, aiming it at Thera. But James lunged and knocked the barrel aside. A blinding shot seared the wall. As mutinous crew members attempted to calm the loyalists, a brutal brawl unfolded. Weapons shot, and the scent of ozone permeated. James clawed and cried, ducking blows and scrambling to avoid live fire. He turned to the main control console in the center of the room. If he could usurp control of the ship systems, he might lock off vital sections and disable the loyalist reinforcements. He crawled across the floor, ignoring the pain in his side. Overhead, sparks cascaded from a ruptured cable. Thera and her companions faced Zakesh's well-trained personal guards. Shouts of defiance rang off the walls. Thera's team ducked behind consoles and returned fire. Each second of gunfire and smoke seemed like an hour. Finally, James arrived at the console. But the interface was in the Varn language. On the verge of panic, he pressed this or that key, hoping to find a lever to make himself secure again. The screen beeped and requested a code. "Do not let that human touch the controls," Zakesh roared from across the bridge. His enormous frame plowed through the rebels like nothing could stop him. James could sense the commander's anger like a wave of heat. He needed more time. "Thera," he shouted. "The console needs a code." Thera, taking cover behind an overturned chair, shouted back, "I'm sending you a data burst." She furiously tapped at a handheld device. A moment later, the console displayed bright lights. It scrolled past lines of alien text, then turned green. James put his palm on the biometric pad, never sure if it would even take a human print. But for Thera's hack, the system beeped in acceptance. Commander Zakesh, mad with rage, charged toward James. But it was too late. James discovered a master override marked with strange symbols. He thought it was what he needed, and he activated it. The ship's artificial gravity flickered. All of a sudden, the floor tipped up as if the ship had been struck, and everyone staggered. Alarms shrieked in protest. Through a nearby window, James witnessed external blast shields retract to expose swirling stars. He realized he suddenly had partial access to the ship's environmental controls. He looked up to find Zakesh standing over him. The alien's fist smashed down. James narrowly rolled aside. His bruised and battered body still ached. The commander slammed his fist down on the console and cracked the screen. There was an eruption of sparks, and the lights faded further. On the other side of the bridge, Thera's crew took the opportunity. They drove back the loyalists, who were retreating toward the door. One by one, the loyal officers woke up to the fact that they were surrounded. Their guns dropped to the ground. Zakesh, though, refused to give up. He seized James by the throat, hauling him off the ground. James felt his throat tighten, vision swimming. "You bugs think you can beat me?" Zakesh snarled. "I will be going back to take this ship, and I will destroy your precious Earth." James attempted to wrest the commander's fingers free. His lungs screamed for air. At that moment, Thera shot once. The energy bolt hit Zakesh's armored shoulder, and he howled in pain and dropped James. Gasping, James crawled away. The commander pivoted on Thera, and a group of rebels assaulted him, bringing him crashing down. They restrained his arms behind his back. Zakesh nevertheless harangued them all with venomous threats. Gasping, James grimaced. He looked at the shattered console, hoping to find whether he still had a chance to seal the bridge. He pressed a flickering icon and a heavy blast door slammed shut, sealing the corridor. Now the bloodied brigands had the bridge controlled. There were loyalists out back still fighting, but they couldn't just come barreling in. A stillness settled over the room, pierced only by sound of cracked electronics on the fritz. The rebels had taken the ship's core. Thura stepped forward to help James to his feet. "We did it," she whispered. James fixed his gaze on Zakesh, held to the ground. The alien's eyes glowed with hatred. Nearby, dutiful officers stood with hands raised and heads bowed in surrender. The moment felt surreal. James was only the farmer's son, yet there he was, taking a battleship from its fearsome commander. Just a moment. The quiet lasted for a moment. Then a frantic voice blared over the intercom. "We have hull breaches on deck 5 and 6. Fire in the engine room. We need help right now." James glanced at the battered rebels. He knew that controlling the bridge was just the beginning. It was a massive vessel, her crew members frightened and devoted, rebellious and disloyal. If it didn't pull together, the ship could rip itself apart. "Listen to me," James yelled, attempting to amplify his voice. "You restore order, or we all die. We are not enemies now. We are referring to the incorrect boat, the wrong fate, the same person. Let's extinguish the fires and save ourselves." Some of Zakesh's loyal officers glared at him, but they glanced at the battered condition of the bridge and knew he was right. Gradually, they doled out nods of approval. The rebels had also understood that if they wanted to survive, the fight could not continue. The group nodded, reluctantly accepting. James crouched next to Zakesh, tied up and held in restraint by 3 rebels. The commander's pride lay in ruins, but his spirit flared like a furnace. "I could keep you at bay or throw you out the airlock," James said gently. "But perhaps you want your crew to survive. Help me save your ship, and perhaps I'll show mercy." Zakesh was panting at him, chest pumping. At last, the alien snarled, "I would have you grovel at my feet, human, but I will not have my ship die. If you require it, I will be taking you through the systems. But do not assume this is over." James nodded grimly. His advantage, and Zakesh still had control of the Radiant Spear systems. Whether to take him alive was both a risk and a potential asset. "Thura," James said, "would you help me arrange for repairs?" She nodded. They faced the central console together and struggled to breathe life back into the battered controls. On the far side of the bridge, the sound of fighting had faded. The word went out that the commander had been captured, and a shaky ceasefire settled in. Rebels and loyalists started to work alongside each other, patching holes and extinguishing flames. Other corpses of Varn littered some corridors, a grim reminder of the price of this uprising. James didn't dwell on how many had perished to afford him this opportunity. As damage reports were communicated to him, James understood the magnitude of the task he now faced. He wasn't merely taking over one room. He was trying to hold together an entire warship. But the alternative was to let the Radiant Spear turn into a drifting tomb. He forced himself to focus. He had gone too far to fail at this point. Using the still-functioning console, Thura activated the firefighting drones, sealing off the worst breaches. She and James diverted power from secondary functions into the medical bays, hoping to save wounded crew members. Zakesh barked orders at the still captive Zizk for stabilizing the drives. The knowledge he had was immeasurable. The rebellion wasn't fully won. The seeds of a new order had been planted. James was right in the middle of it all. His plan had brought him to this moment, but now, he must decide what to do with the vanquished commander and his loyalists. Revenge would be easy, though it might only stoke more hatred. To extend mercy might seem weak, but it could also pave the way to cooperation. The whole ship was waiting for his choice, and soon enough the galaxy beyond would hear of it. So James thought of Earth, of his family, of the farm that was gone. The alien commanders had laughed at him, had mocked his entire species. It was his fault, no question. It should be him standing on the other side of the wreckage. But the truth, as he stared at the fallen bridge and the humbled figure of Zakesh, A wave of conflicting emotions ran through him. But now the final confrontation was approaching. At that moment, he would define what being human meant for the Varn, and by extension, the universe. The console flashed pinpricks of red warnings as the ship's status hung before them in a shattered mosaic. Fires continued to burn in some remote areas, but the ship was no longer in immediate danger of blowing up. The upper decks had been secured by the rebels, and the Loyalists' resistance was crumbling. But there was one last test. He had to secure his grip on the radiant spear. He moved from the console, turning to face the kneeling Zakesh under guard. The commander's proud stance was bent, and blood trailed from a gash on his brow. For a moment, neither spoke. The war of wills played out under the silence of a bridge. "I have the power now," James said, attempting to keep his voice calm. "You forfeited any right to command when you mocked my species and transformed this ship into a house of terror. But I offer you a choice. Bring peace to this vessel, or I will ensure you never threaten anyone ever again." Zakesh spat on the floor. "You think I fear you, human? Your people are bugs next to the Varn. If you kill me, you just show your barbarity. You may have let me live, but I will bide my time and strike again." He said this with a derisive tone. James felt anger rise. He recalled how the Varn ships had torn through his colony, how Zakesh had made him bow. His fingers balled into fists, but then he saw Thera and the others who had gone with him. Their hunger was for more than revenge. They wanted a better future. James forced himself to slowly exhale, letting his anger begin to subside. "Guards," he said at last. "Take him down to the holding cell. Monitoring him constantly." Cleaning Zakesh was on the ground. The rebels pulled him to the feet. The commander's face twisted into a mask of hatred, but he fought back. He was taken away, and James was left standing in the middle of the bridge. Thera was approaching, eyes tired but hopeful. "Now what?" she asked. "And now we show everyone on board that this ship never had to be ruled by fear," James replied. "We reach out to the crew. We offer them safety if they stand down. We care for the injured, rebel and loyalist alike. We become allies and work to mend this ship together." Thera nodded. Taking a ragged breath, she brought up the ship-wide broadcast system. "This is James, a human," he said into the microphone, his voice reverberating in every corridor. "Commander Zakesh has lost control. We have the bridge, and we are steadying the ship. To all who seek an end to the fighting and to be united, report to your stations. You will not be harmed. We only want to save everyone on this boat." At first, there was silence. Then there were scattered voices, tentatively confirming their surrender or offering help. Gradually, the tide started to turn. Rebels set down arms, loyalists retreated from losing positions, and the wounded Varn were carried to medical bays. A cautious peace was found as all members of the crew recognized the one they were fighting would kill them all if they did not stop fighting. James slumped into the commander's chair, weariness drenching his soul. He had fantasized about overthrowing his captors, of validating humanity. Now he had done it. But the burden was heavy. The radiant spear, a shattered warship of torn-apart aliens. Could he really lead them? The rebels connected with the few remaining officers to bring back up critical systems, and hours passed. The fires were contained, and the atmosphere stabilized in damaged areas. The casualties were collected, their remains denuded and shrouded with full respect. Varn were never the same as humans, but a silent bond of communion started to grow. They had clashed, but now they all wanted to survive. James rose to check on the engine repairs when a call came in. A Varn patrol fleet had just appeared. The scanning systems detected multiple cruisers on an intercept course. Among the rebels, panic flared. There was a risk the fleet would learn of the mutiny and fire on a dime. "We've got to show them we're in control," James said. "We'll send out a message. The Radiant Spear is compromised, and we require aid. I won't tell you everything, but I'll ask for assistance under the commander's authorization codes." Thera hesitated. But what if they see the ruse? Unless Zakesh has already given them a warning somehow? James surveyed the ragged hulk of a ship he was on. He did not believe they would survive a full assault. "We have to risk it. Have them board us and see the commander in chains. Then maybe we can get them not to do this." The thought made him feel like his chest was tightening. If the patrol fleet stayed true to Zakesh, all the revolt could be stamped out. But there was no other choice. And so as the radiant spear limped through space, engines sputtering, James readied himself for one final confrontation. He now had the reins, but keeping them tightly gripped against the strength of the Varn Empire would be a different war. A part of him wished that he could just fly away, but that was to leave behind the crew that has supported him. So he stood tall, the burden of command on him. This was the time that the galaxy would find out that humans were not to be trifled with. Radiant spear damaged, the patrol fleet arrived within the hour, completing a menacing arc around her. Their scanners pinged the wounded ship, looking for signs of treachery. On the bridge inside stood James and Thura trying to mask their nerves. They'd readied the vessel as best they could, powering down non-essential systems so that they would appear less threatening. A hail goes through, asking for identification. James paused and opened a channel. "This is Acting Captain James of the Radiant Spear," he added. "Commander Zakesh is not available to respond. We've taken a heavy hit, and we need help." He hoped his voice sounded confident. Silence stretched, then a terse response. "Where is Commander Zakesh?" "But we have been ordered to escort the Radiant Spear to the homeworld. We see abnormal power spikes and extensive structural degradation." "Explain yourself." James steeled himself. "The commander is injured and receiving medical care. The unknown enemy attacked our ship. We've driven them off, but we're in no condition to travel." It was only a partial lie. He hoped it would buy time. The lead cruiser closed in, its docking clamps extending. James felt his pulse race. If the mutiny was discovered by a boarding party, they could kill everyone. The weapons systems of the Radiant Spear were down, and its crew was in no shape for another fight. Yet it was too late to turn around. He had the hangar bay opened. The Varn boarding craft slid in, and a squad of armed soldiers in gleaming armor hopped out. James arranged a modest welcome party, with reformed rebels and loyalists who would maintain the pretense. Thura stood by, prepared with a hidden override to shut sections of the ship if things went sideways. The Varn soldiers strode in and looked suspiciously around the corridors. Their leader, a stern-featured officer, requested to see the commander. James led them to the hastily set-up medical bay, where Zakesh was strapped down, his wounds bandaged. He had been sedated to keep him from barking at the visitors. The officer's eyes narrowed. How was he injured in this way? Where is the rest of the senior staff? Thura stepped forward. Others were killed in the attack. We are all that remain. This ship is falling apart at the seams, and we've got to get it repaired. The officer opened up Zakesh's eyelids and took a look at his sedation levels. Then Oscar watched her eyes narrow as she looked at James's human form. A human manning a Varn warship? This is most irregular. James took a slow breath. "I'm leading because someone needs to lead," he added. "I am supported by faithful Varn officers. Survival is all we are concerned with now." He waved at the even battered state of the corridors, the flickery lights. "Help us, and we will work with you. Attack us, and you should consider us all dead." For a tense moment, the policeman appeared poised to summon James's arrest. Then it was a loyal officer of the Radiant Spear, who had seen Zakesh's cruelty up close, who intervened. "Yes, sir," he said, moving close. "Commander Zakesh was careless. He nearly got us all killed. The humans stabilized the ship, and the makeshift repairs saved our lives. We wouldn't be here now if it weren't for his acts." The officer's stance relaxed a bit. He looked at his squad, then at the sedation monitor. "Very well," he said slowly. "We'll assist with repair, but this is not over," he said. "Once the ship is functional, we shall guide you to the High Council. They will decide your fate." James lowered his head in acquiescence. "Thank you." And so began an uneasy truce. The patrol fleet dispatched scores of engineers and supplies. Along with Thura's team, they sealed hull breaches and repaired critical systems. Medical workers attended to the wounded, including Zakesh. The commander's condition was stabilized. He remained with guards. In the meantime, rumors about the human who took charge circulated throughout the fleet. Some ridiculed the idea. Some were moved by his courage. Some thought he had cast some kind of clever spell, For how else could a mere mortal overthrow a Varn commander? The fleet pushed it toward the Varn homeworld when the Radiant Spear was finally capable of space travel again. At the helm stood James, dread mingling with resolve. He knew that trial, or something worse, awaited him. But he also thought news of this would change how humans were viewed in the galaxy. They would no longer be dismissed as weak creatures. He had proved that human will was capable of rattling even the staunchest adversary. As the soaring steeples of the Varn capital appeared on the horizon, a thrilling dread shot through James. He wondered what judgment he would be facing. Or, maybe, they would think of him as a criminal who had stolen a ship. Or maybe they would understand that his act of uprising had saved 1,000,000 lives. Whatever the case was, the Radiant Spear was proof that humans were not to be trifled with. She turned to James just before they landed. "No matter what, you inspired us," she said softly. "You taught us that we can shatter cruelty and fear. You taught us that for every being there is a right to hope." James managed a small smile. "I wouldn't have been able to do it without you," he said. "And I will cherish the friendships I made here." The ship landed on a sprawling landing pad, dwarfed by dazzling alien architecture. Guards stood ready to guide them to the council. There was Zakesh, shackled in chains and made to walk, who shot James a look of unadulterated hate. But James no longer quaked under that gaze. As James stepped onto the deck of the Radiant Spear, he felt the collective gaze of an empire upon him. His heart pounded with uncertainty. Yet he held his head high. He had committed his deeds, and the future was a blank page. Whatever the outcome, one truth burned bright. The alien commanders had once laughed at him, but that laughter had turned to silence, replaced now by a single unassailable fact. Never again would humans be mocked or ignored. And this was just the beginning of a saga that would reverberate through the stars.